Only 18 minutes passed between Meghan Markle's smiling entrance into the GMA studio and her furious exit. What happened in those 18 minutes would change her media career forever. The Good Morning America studio hummed with its familiar pre-show energy as crew members made final adjustments to lighting and camera angles. The iconic Times Square backdrop gleamed through the windows, and the cheerful morning show set radiated the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had made GMA a staple in American homes for decades. Michael Strahan sat at the anchor desk, reviewing his notes one final time. The former NFL giant had transformed himself from defensive end to beloved television personality, bringing the same intensity and focus that had made him a Hall of Fame player to his role as co-host. His infectious smile and genuine warmth had made him one of morning television's most trusted faces, but beneath that friendly exterior lay the competitive spirit of a man who had spent years facing down some of the toughest opponents in professional sports. Robin Roberts shuffled through her own preparation materials, her pen moving across her script as she made last-minute notations. As a veteran of countless high-profile interviews, she could sense when a guest appearance might venture into unpredictable territory. Today felt like one of those days. The booking had come together quickly, too quickly, perhaps, and there was something about the rushed nature of Meghan Markle's latest media blitz that made seasoned journalists like Robin wonder what story was really being told. George Stephanopoulos occupied his usual position at the desk, his political correspondent instincts already activated. He had covered enough scandal and controversy to recognize the signs when someone was trying to control a narrative that was threatening to slip away from them. Meghan's recent appearances had been increasingly defensive, increasingly emotional, and he suspected today might be the day when that carefully constructed facade finally cracked. At 7:47 a.m., a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the ABC studios. Meghan Markle emerged wearing a perfectly tailored burgundy blazer over a cream silk blouse, her hair styled in loose waves that caught the morning light streaming through the studio's floor-to-ceiling windows. She moved with practiced confidence, each step calculated to project poise and authority, but those who looked closely might have noticed a slight tightness around her eyes, the kind that comes from someone who spent too many sleepless nights anticipating difficult questions. Her entourage followed at a respectful distance. A publicist with a tablet full of talking points, a makeup artist carrying touch-up supplies, and a security detail that seemed larger than usual for a morning show appearance. The fact that she needed such extensive support for what was supposed to be a friendly promotional interview spoke volumes about her current state of mind. The green room provided a momentary sanctuary from the controlled chaos of live television production. Meghan sat in a plush chair, sipping chamomile tea while her team made final preparations. Her latest book, another children's story about empowerment and finding your voice, sat prominently on the table beside her, its colorful cover designed to convey warmth and accessibility. This was supposed to be safe territory, a soft landing after weeks of increasingly hostile media coverage. 5 minutes to air, a production assistant announced, and Meghan felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. She had done this dance hundreds of times by now, but morning television was different. The audience was broader, more unpredictable, and less forgiving than the carefully curated environments she had grown accustomed to controlling. Her publicist leaned in for one final strategy session. "Remember, we stick to the book and the foundation work. If they try to go elsewhere, just redirect back to the positive messaging. You've got this." Meghan nodded, though her fingers betrayed her nervousness as they drummed against the armrest of her chair. She had trained herself to project confidence in any situation, but there was something about Michael Strahan that made her uneasy. He wasn't like the usual soft-touch morning show hosts who lobbed gentle questions and nodded sympathetically at rehearsed responses. There was an intensity about him, a competitive edge that reminded her uncomfortably of the investigative journalists who had made her life so difficult in recent years. The walk from the green room to the studio floor felt both eternal and instantaneous. Bright lights, bustling crew members, and the quiet hum of electronic equipment created an atmosphere of controlled energy. Multiple cameras tracked her movement as she made her way to the interview area, their red recording lights already glowing ominously. Michael Strahan stood to greet her, his imposing 6 feet 5 inches frame towering over her even in her highest heels. His smile was warm and genuine, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness that suggested this interview might not follow the usual promotional playbook. "Meghan, thank you so much for being here this morning," he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake that lasted just a beat longer than necessary. "We're really looking forward to talking with you." "Thank you for having me, Michael," she replied, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone she had perfected, confident but not arrogant, warm but not overly familiar. "It's always a pleasure to be here with the GMA family." Robin Roberts joined them at the interview area, and the three of them engaged in the kind of pre-interview small talk that was designed to put guests at ease. They discussed the book's beautiful illustrations, the importance of literacy for children, and how wonderful it was to see her again. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. 30 seconds to live, the floor director announced, and everyone took their positions. Meghan settled into the guest chair, crossing her legs at the ankles in that distinctly royal posture she had never quite abandoned, despite years of trying to project a more accessible image. Her book sat prominently on the coffee table between them, positioned at the perfect angle to catch the studio lights. The red lights on the cameras blinked on, and suddenly they were broadcasting to millions of homes across America. "Good morning, America," Robin began with her characteristic warmth and authority. "We're joined now by Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, who's here to talk about her inspiring new children's book." "Meghan, welcome back to GMA." "Good morning, Robin." "Thank you so much for having me," Meghan replied, her smile bright and camera-ready. "It's wonderful to be here." Michael leaned forward slightly, his expression interested and engaged. "This book is really beautiful, Meghan. The illustrations are stunning, and the message about children finding their own voices is so important. What inspired you to write this particular story?" It was exactly the kind of question she had prepared for, and Meghan's response flowed smoothly. She spoke eloquently about the importance of empowering young people, about how her own journey had taught her the value of authentic expression, and about wanting to create something that would inspire children to believe in their own potential. For the first 8 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The questions were gentle, focused on the book and her charitable work. Meghan felt herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of a promotional interview, her answers becoming more natural and spontaneous as her confidence grew. But then Michael's tone shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible to viewers but immediately obvious to Meghan. His smile remained warm, but something in his posture had changed. A subtle straightening that suggested he was about to move into more challenging territory. "You know, Meghan, one of the things that really struck me about this book is how it deals with themes of truth-telling and finding your authentic voice," he said, picking up the book and flipping through a few pages. "It made me think about your own journey over the past few years, and how you've certainly been vocal about your own truth." Meghan's internal warning system activated, though she maintained her composed exterior. "Well, I think it's important for everyone to feel empowered to share their authentic experiences, especially when those experiences might help others who are facing similar challenges." Michael nodded thoughtfully, but instead of moving on to the next prepared question, he remained focused on this line of inquiry. "Absolutely. And you've certainly been sharing your experiences quite openly. The interviews, the documentaries, the book projects. There's been a lot of storytelling." There was something in the way he said, "storytelling," that made Meghan's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. "Yes, well, I think it's important to control your own narrative rather than letting others define your story." "That makes perfect sense," Michael agreed, but then he leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "But here's what I'm curious about, Meghan. When you're telling your story, especially in such public forums, don't you think there's a responsibility to make sure that story is completely accurate?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Robin Roberts glanced at Michael with an expression that suggested this wasn't the direction they had planned to take the interview. George Stephanopoulos shifted in his seat, his political instincts telling him they were moving into dangerous territory. Meghan's smile became slightly more forced. "Of course, I've always been committed to sharing my truth as honestly and authentically as possible." "Your truth," Michael repeated, and there was something about the way he emphasized those words that made it clear he was drawing a distinction. "That's an interesting phrase. Because the thing about truth is, it shouldn't really need a possessive pronoun, should it? Truth is just truth." The studio seemed to grow quieter, though the ambient noise level hadn't actually changed. Meghan's hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, began to fidget with her wedding ring, a tell that body language experts would later analyze frame by frame. "I think everyone has their own perspective on their experiences," she said carefully, her voice carrying the slightest defensive edge. "What matters is that people feel empowered to share their authentic experiences." Michael nodded as if he completely understood, but then he pulled out a tablet that had been sitting beside his chair, a prop that hadn't been there during the book discussion. "See, that's what I want to understand better. Because I've been looking at some of the claims you've made in various interviews, and I have to say, there seem to be some discrepancies between your perspective and what can be verified." Meghan's composure began to crack in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. Her breathing became slightly more shallow, and her smile took on a brittle quality that hadn't been there moments before. "I'm not sure what you mean by discrepancies, Michael," she said, though her voice suggested she knew exactly what he meant. Michael's expression remained friendly, but his tone had taken on the focus and intensity that had made him one of the most feared pass rushers in NFL history. "Well, for example, in your interview with Oprah, you talked about how isolated and unsupported you felt during your time as a working royal. But we know from court documents and palace records that you actually had access to mental health resources, that meetings were arranged, that support was offered. So why present it as if you were completely abandoned? The color began to drain from Meghan's face, though her professional makeup artists had done such excellent work that it wasn't immediately obvious to viewers. Her voice, however, carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "That's a very simplistic way of looking at a very complex situation," she replied, her defensive mechanisms fully activated now. "Just because resources exist on paper doesn't mean they're accessible or appropriate for the specific challenges someone is facing." Michael leaned back slightly, studying her with the same intensity he had once used to read opposing quarterbacks. "Okay, I can accept that explanation. But what about the timeline issues? You've said in various interviews that you reached out for help and were denied, but the palace has documentation showing that you declined several offered meetings and resources. How do you reconcile those contradictory accounts?" Meghan's hands were now gripping the armrests of her chair with enough force that her knuckles had begun to show white beneath her carefully applied hand cream. "I think you're oversimplifying a very complex and painful situation for the sake of creating controversy." "I'm not trying to create controversy," Michael said, his voice remaining maddeningly calm and reasonable. "I'm trying to understand the truth. Because when someone makes public allegations about how they were treated by one of the world's most prominent institutions, people deserve to know what actually happened." Robin Roberts, sensing that the interview was spiraling into territory that could be dangerous for everyone involved, attempted to intervene. "Michael, maybe we should—" "No, it's okay," Meghan interrupted, though her voice suggested it was anything but okay. "I'm happy to address these questions." But her body language told a completely different story. She had shifted in her chair, turning slightly away from Michael, and her breathing had become noticeably more rapid. Michael pressed forward with the relentless determination that had made him a Hall of Fame player. "Here's what I really want to understand, Meghan. You've built a narrative around being silenced and controlled during your time in the royal family. But since leaving, you've had complete control over your voice, your platform, your message. So why does that message keep changing depending on the audience and the context?" The question struck at the heart of the fundamental contradiction that had plagued Meghan's post-royal career. She wanted to be seen as both a victim and an empowered woman, both silenced and speaking truth, both seeking privacy and courting publicity. Meghan's composure was beginning to unravel in real time. Her voice rose just enough to be noticeable as she responded. "My message hasn't changed. I've consistently spoken about the importance of mental health, about the challenges of adjusting to life in the public eye, about the need for compassion and understanding. But the details keep shifting," Michael continued, his voice carrying the same relentless pressure he had once applied to opposing offensive lines. "The timeline changes, the claims evolve, the level of victimization increases with each telling. That's not consistency. That's story development." Something inside Meghan snapped. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the sympathetic tears of someone sharing pain. They were the angry tears of someone who had been cornered and exposed. "How dare you," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "How dare you sit there and question my lived experience, my pain, my truth?" Michael didn't back down. If anything, her emotional response seemed to confirm his suspicions about the authenticity of her narrative. "I'm not questioning your pain, Meghan. I'm questioning your facts. And there's a difference." "My facts?" Meghan's voice was getting louder now, and the cameras captured every micro-expression of her growing fury. "These aren't facts we're talking about. These are my experiences, my feelings, my reality. And you're sitting here trying to fact-check my emotions like I'm some kind of liar." "I'm not calling you a liar," Michael said, his voice remaining steady and controlled in stark contrast to her escalating emotion. "But when someone makes public claims that can be verified or disputed, those claims become fair game for scrutiny. That's how journalism works." Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair rocking slightly from the force of her movement. The sudden action caused every camera operator to adjust their shots, and the studio fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment and the sound of her rapid breathing. "This interview is over," she declared, her voice breaking on the words. "I came here to talk about a children's book, not to be attacked and humiliated by someone who clearly has an agenda." Michael remained seated, looking up at her with an expression that was part surprise, part concern, and part confirmation that his instincts about her had been correct. "Meghan, I don't have an agenda. I'm asking the same questions that millions of people have been wondering about." "Questions?" Meghan's voice had risen to nearly a shout, though she was still trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Those weren't questions. Those were accusations disguised as journalism. You invited me here under false pretenses so you could ambush me on live television." Robin Roberts stood as well, clearly trying to defuse the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. "Meghan, please, let's all just take a breath here. I think there might be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Meghan cut her off, tears now streaming down her face despite her desperate attempts to maintain her composure. "This was planned from the beginning. You people never change. You invite us on your shows, you pretend to be supportive, and then you attack us when we're most vulnerable." Michael finally stood, his imposing frame making the situation even more tense. "Meghan, that wasn't my intention at all. I was simply trying to understand." "I don't care what your intention was," she interrupted, her voice cracking with emotion. "The result is the same. You've humiliated me, you've disrespected my experiences, and you've proven that nothing has changed in how the media treats people like me." She grabbed her purse from the floor beside her chair, her movements jerky and uncoordinated in her emotional state. "I'm done with this. I'm done with all of you." As she turned to leave, Michael made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Meghan, please don't go. We can finish this conversation in a different way. We can talk about your book, your foundation work." She whirled around to face him, her face streaked with mascara and tears, her carefully styled hair now slightly disheveled. "You want to know the truth, Michael? The truth is that people like you will never let me move on. You'll never let me just be a mother, an author, a philanthropist. You'll always drag me back to the worst moments of my life because that's what sells, because that's what gets ratings." Her voice broke completely on the final words, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if trying to hold back a sob. "I thought maybe, just maybe, things could be different here. I thought I could trust Good Morning America. But you're all the same." With that devastating final statement, she turned and walked quickly toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically against the studio floor. The cameras followed her until she disappeared through the stage door, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the production crew seemed to have stopped breathing. For several long moments, nobody moved. Michael stood frozen in place, running his hand over his face in a gesture that revealed, for the first time, that he wasn't as composed as he had appeared during the interview. Robin Roberts looked between the exit and the cameras, clearly struggling with how to proceed. George Stephanopoulos remained seated, but his expression suggested he was already calculating the political and professional fallout from what had just occurred. Finally, Michael sat back down, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like regret. He looked directly into the camera, his expression serious and slightly shaken. "That was not how we intended this interview to go," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth and energy. "Our goal here is always to have honest, respectful conversations with our guests." Robin Roberts, drawing on decades of professional experience, attempted to restore some normalcy to the situation. "When we come back, we'll be discussing the latest developments in the economy with our business correspondent." But everyone knew that nothing could follow what they had just witnessed. The rest of the show would be anticlimactic, a footnote to a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated for months to come. As the cameras cut away for commercial, Michael looked at his co-hosts with an expression of genuine uncertainty. "Did I push too hard?" he asked quietly. Robin shook her head slowly. "You asked legitimate questions, Michael. If she couldn't handle them, that says more about her than it does about you." George, ever the political analyst, was already thinking ahead. "She's going to say we ambushed her. Her team is probably already crafting the response about media harassment and unfair treatment." "Maybe we did ambush her," Michael admitted, still processing what had happened. "But those were questions that needed to be asked. If she's going to make public claims, shouldn't she be prepared to defend them?" The three of them sat in the artificial calm of the commercial break, knowing that when they returned to air, they would have to somehow continue as if one of the most dramatic moments in morning television history hadn't just occurred right in front of them. Meanwhile, somewhere in the ABC building, Meghan Markle was probably in a bathroom, trying to repair her makeup and compose herself enough to face the photographers who would inevitably be waiting outside. Her publicist was likely fielding frantic phone calls and drafting statements about journalistic ambushes and unfair treatment. But the damage was done. In 18 minutes, a routine promotional interview had become a masterclass in how quickly carefully constructed narratives can crumble under sustained questioning. Whether you believed Michael's questions were fair or aggressive, whether you thought Meghan's tears were genuine or calculated, one thing was undeniable: the facade of control she had worked so hard to maintain had been shattered on live television. The truth, as Michael had suggested, doesn't need a possessive pronoun. And sometimes, the most revealing truth is found not in what people say, but in how they react when their words are challenged by someone who refuses to accept surface-level answers. In those 18 minutes, America had seen both the best and worst of modern media, the importance of asking difficult questions, and the human cost when those questions hit their mark.